Hello and welcome to the Mushroom Murder Trial podcast. My name is Lisa. Now, before we start today, please subscribe to my newsletter at mushroommurdertrial.com and also rate, follow and review this podcast on your preferred platform. And if you're on Apple, please review this podcast. And hello to all my new friends from YouTube and Instagram. Welcome aboard. Those of you who received the newsletter earlier this week will be aware we are still waiting for a sentencing date for Erin Patterson, but I found this about the trial from the Law Society Journal, and it reads, "Indeed, taking into consideration the strength of this evidence," they're talking about Erin's trial, "it is perhaps surprising that Patterson did not plead guilty to murder, given the discount on sentence she may have received. She chose to take her chances with a jury. Ultimately, she failed. I imagine her extremely competent legal team put that to her and she said, no, I am not guilty, I'm innocent and I'm going to do trial by jury." Well, it didn't work out for you, did it, Erin? I'm sure if you asked her today, are you still saying you're innocent, she would say she was. It's a personality thing, but more about that in a second. Now, the sentence for murder in Victoria is life imprisonment. This does not necessarily mean life in prison, for the non-parole period is 30 years, unless a court considers it not in the interests of justice to set such a term. Quote, "Erin Patterson will likely receive a life sentence with a non-parole period that is in keeping with her victims. The head sentence and the non-parole period will be set by Justice Christopher Beale after sentencing submissions coming in the days and weeks to come." So there you go. That's a bit of an update for you. But let's move on now to what I call inheritance, injustice, and the making of Erin Patterson. So the last two episodes we've been looking at Erin and her husband, Simon Patterson, but now we're going to move on and focus more on Erin and her family. What we know, what we don't know. When it comes to Erin Patterson, we hear a lot about the so-called rivers of gold, the money that trickled down to her through inheritance from her grandmother and mother. But this week, I went digging into her genetic inheritance, her family history, and I was expecting to find maybe more than a few criminal skeletons. While there's no single criminality gene, research suggests genetic factors can influence, obviously, an individual's predisposition towards certain behaviours, which may increase the likelihood of criminal activity, particularly when interacting with environmental factors. But I didn't find a sociopath, an armed robber, or even a jaywalker in Erin's family. I instead, on her mother's side, found a war hero. Now, Erin's maternal grandfather wasn't a villain. He was a soldier, a man like many others, returned from the horrors of war to raise a family in suburban Australia. His name was Victor Ray Cameron, and he was cited for gallant and distinguished services in the Southwest Pacific area in 1945. Now, he was serving at the time in New Guinea, so what is now known as Papua New Guinea. And he was recommended for this acknowledgement by the Governor-General to the King of England. And I have found on his war record a letter from the King, or the King's representative, and it said, "Mentioned in dispatches, His Majesty the King has been graciously pleased to approve that the following be mentioned for having rendered gallant and distinguished services in the Southwest Pacific area. Signaller Victor Ray Cameron from the 6th Division of the Australian Army." So that's a massive deal, and he has a page on the Australian War Memorial's website. Now, this is a jarring contrast to what I've been told about Erin and how she paints the past, a past that she describes as cold, alienating, and deeply unfair. I'm not saying that nothing happened to Erin as a child. I'm just trying to build a bigger picture. Now, Erin, in my view is fueled by more than anger and resentment. She is absorbed by a sense of righteousness, that she has been wronged, that the world owes her something. And that belief, however diluted, might help explain what came next. But let's rewind for a moment. So Erin's mother was Heather Margaret Cameron. That's what she was born as. And she's the daughter of Victor and Margaret Cameron. She was later known as Dr. Heather Scutter. And obviously, she became an academic. She was exceptionally bright, funny, and sharp. She trained as an English teacher and she taught in Adelaide before marrying Eaton Hugh Scutter, known as Hugh. That's Erin's dad. He's a government worker descended from Jewish immigrants. I've spoken about them before. We're going to focus now on Erin's maternal side. Needless to say, Hugh's family, they did come from Russia and Belarus via Egypt into Australia. And his parents met in Tel Aviv, which is now Israel, during World War II. And his dad also served in the Australian Army. Now, it is Erin's mother who looms large in this, and it's based off Erin, but also because there's quite a digital footprint for her mother because she was an academic. She seems quite formidable, an academic who wrote about children's and youth literature. She was whip smart and had a bit of a biting tone, but then so do I. You know, I'm a little bit sarcastic, as I'm sure you've noticed. Her 1999 book, Displaced Fictions, ruffled feathers for its blunt, critical style. I've got to tell you something that happened. This New Zealander comedian, I upset her, and I just don't know how, but the other night I was going to bed and I just had a look on Instagram, and this New Zealand comedian had called me Catty and my podcast Catty. Anyway, so I was like, oh, well, you know, I'm not in any interest of having a war with another creator. So I just sent her love, as my friend Jackson would say, namaste. So yes, I was mocked by this New Zealand comedian. She drives around her car and talks about Erin, and she says I was really catty. But she did say she quite enjoyed me being catty. So that's good. I approve of that. But that's the first time I've been mocked by a proper comedian. Ding dong. Anyway, going back to Dr. Scutter. She is whip smart, biting tone, and her book, Displaced Fictions, ruffled feathers for its blunt, critical style. One reviewer called it facetious. Others said it carried maintained rage. What do you think? But she also wrote in one of her university papers about helping a taxi driver pick a gift for his mum. I fly into Adelaide from Melbourne early on the morning of the first day of the Views from the Reviews, and am driven to the Orphanage Teachers Centre in an old Ford by a young Greek taxi driver who is anxious for suggestions for his Mother's Day presents that weekend. We run the gamut to fluffy slippers and settle on a box of Cadbury roses. So look, she must be quite friendly. Chatting with the taxi driver? Now, she goes to talk about once she arrives at the orphanage to get ready for this conference, there are the usual clusters of people gathered around tables of books and advertising material. Many of them seem to know each other, but I hardly know any of them and am shy of attaching myself anywhere. So that's interesting. She was a little bit shy because I've been told through the neighbours she was quite outgoing, but maybe she just needs to get to know people. Anyway, reading between the lines, you find a woman who never forgot about her own upbringing. In her words, she was, quote, a working-class kid short of many things besides stories, and she was raised on the post-war suburban edges of Melbourne. It's fair to say that her first love was books. Now, when Victor Cameron, who worked in electronics throughout his life, died in 2008, his memorial notice listed his 7 children, 13 grandchildren and 10 great-grandchildren. Heather was the second oldest daughter, and as I said to you, her first love was books. Now, I found where she's been cited in academic papers. So when she was growing up post-war, she noted that at the time, Australian children's reading differed little from that of their British counterparts. I think I may have mentioned that last time. Scutter mentions various children's books from her father's childhood that remained upon the family's bookshelves. She also recollects that annuals from her childhood home included a 1925 copy of Mrs. Strang's Annual for Girls and another Strang, a Gallant for Girls, both of which had originally belonged to her mother. As well as being useful as gift books, many of these annuals were given as prizes to children. She also talks about how these were responsible for turning her into an empire girl of the 1950s, devouring tales of daring do in boys' books on her family bookshelves. Scutter recalls that the books belonging to her father were all reward and prize books. As she also remarks, reward books were ubiquitous, and some of those on the family bookshelves had been acquired from neighbours who had received them as prizes in the early 20th century. The books belonging to Scutter's mother were a 1924 reprint of Charles Kingsley's The Water Babies. She actually did a paper on that, Dr. Scutter, and 2 old Christmas annuals, which, like the Kingsley, had been presented to my mother in her childhood. They were the 2 I mentioned before, the Annual for Girls, the Garland for Girls. Scutter states that all these books were presents to her mother, quote, in her childhood. So these English children's annuals contained magazine-type literature. So Dr. Scutter built a life out of books, ideas, and academic pursuit. Maybe she didn't have much emotional room for her children. I don't know. The only person that knows is Erin's sister, and I do not think she is going to speak. She's a cake decorator, quite a good one now. She used to be a volcanologist, so I'm not going to name her because I don't think it's fair. Can you imagine? Anyway, Erin didn't idolise her. She described her mother as a cold robot in Facebook messages sent shortly after Heather's death. That's Dr. Scutter. In 2019, Erin compared her childhood to life in a, quote, Russian orphanage, claiming she wasn't hugged, wasn't nurtured, and was routinely made to feel unwanted. Quote, my mother was ultra weird her whole life, she wrote. Now, I don't need to stick up for Heather here, but she can't stick up for herself. So I just need to say, and she could have been terrible at home, I don't know, but her colleagues all loved her and her students loved her. But yes, please don't come for me, she could have been terrible at home, I don't know. So Erin said in these messages, her father, Hugh, tried to show love but was shouted down for it. That any tenderness was spoiling her and her sister. The atmosphere at home, she claimed, was so tense that the girls would retreat to their rooms and try to avoid being noticed. Quote, my sister and I would hide in our room most of the time, so we couldn't do anything wrong. But again, we need to look at Erin's version of life against the evidence as well. So I went back and had a look at what she said about her. And in terms of her explanation for the crime, it's kind of relevant. Okay, so on day 25 of the trial, her barrister, Colin Mandy SC, asked Erin about her eating habits. Quote, I mean, it's been a roller coaster over the years. When I was a kid, would weigh us every week to make sure we weren't putting on too much weight, Erin said. I went to the extreme of barely eating at all then, but during adulthood, going the other way and binging, I guess, I never had a good relationship with food. So where this comes in was Erin was apparently going to have gastric band surgery to control her weight. And she was explaining she didn't want anyone to know. She needed help with the kids, but she didn't want them to know. So she was indicating she might have had or cancer treatment or whatever it was at that particular time. So that's quite significant. Now, I'm not saying that any of these things didn't happen, but when it comes to Erin, it pays to be skeptical, don't you think? Now, her dad, apparently, he was quiet and loved the guide dogs they trained for the Blind Society. Nothing unusual there, except for this story. Okay, so my friend Harper Ellis from the group, she reminded me of this. When we first met Erin, she wanted advice because there were a couple of lawyers in the group, the Kelly Lane group, you may have heard of it, And she wanted advice because Erin had been training this dog to go back to the Blind Society, and her kids became quite attached. And when she gave it back to them, Erin said, I want that dog back. My kids are really attached to it. They said, no, it's our dog. And Erin wanted to sue them. And I was like, oh my God, I remember that. So thank you, Harper. You're a legend for reminding me. But Erin's always been a deeply unreliable narrator. And it's undeniable that she struggled long before the murders. She couldn't find her place. She couldn't land a career that matched her intellect or her sense of purpose. Her life was marked by frustration. She was also so frightened when she had her son as a tiny little baby. She didn't know what to do. I can understand that. That's a lot of women feel that way. So yes, my heart kind of went out to her there. Guess who saved the day? Gail Patterson. Showed her how to bond with her child and how to settle him. Isn't that sad? That's so heartbreaking. Those people had never given her anything but love. And this is what she did. It's terrible. So drift was a thing with Erin. She would drift from one house to the next, back and forth. We spoke about that in the previous episode. But in her own mind, she'd been dealt a cruel hand in life, emotionally, financially, and socially. If we're looking to understand her crimes, I don't believe we'll find it in her romantic relationships. We need to look back further. Now, this is so good. When I saw this, I was like, this is incredible. We need to look at who Erin is at her core. And I think she's been, quote, a lifelong injustice collector. And that's a term that is used sometimes in criminology. And I found an article by psychotherapist Dr. Tom Moon, and he says injustice collectors are some of the unhappiest people you'll ever meet. They endlessly on the wrongs they believe they've suffered. They live in a mental prison of helplessness, hurt and rage, fueled by a longing for vengeance. Dr. Moon writes that they often feel no moral responsibility because in their minds they've already been made victims. They justify cruelty because someone has to pay. They demonize others so thoroughly, so persistently that they convince themselves revenge is not only justified, it's righteous. An injustice collector also refers to criminals. Okay, so it's not just your average person in the street who may take and perceive any slight wrongs done against them and escalate them into serious events and attempt to right them, almost always through means of murder and violence. Paradoxically, injustice collectors sometimes have a huge capacity for insensitivity and cruelty. Doctor says the reason is that this mindset always involves demonizing others because somebody or some group has to fill the role of the perpetrator. And when we are in a trance of this mindset, the perpetrator or oppressor can become the omnipotent. Very interesting, isn't it? Sounds like a 9/11 terrorist. Anything they do, any level of vengeance is justifiable. These responses are disproportionate to the original grievance. And we can just see that play out in Erin's case time and time again. Their reaction to the real or perceived injustice is just totally out of hand. This tendency of extreme overreaction can be seen in their history. So we see when Erin had the drunk driving charge, in prior interactions with others over insignificant issues. So maybe in the workplace where they called her, quote, Scutter the Nutter. They called her that, not me. Okay? So the deaths of Don, Gail, Heather, and Ian's near fatal illness, these weren't random acts. They were the product of obsession, intellect, and precision. Cold calculation dressed up in family ties. Erin, who bemoaned her childhood, chose to murder her victims in the heart of her home, the kitchen. She also chose to menace people from a happy family unit, the Pattersons and the Wilkinsons. At the end of the day, Erin is self-righteous with a dash of perpetual victim, and she is so arrogant. While I was writing this, I remembered a discussion I had with her in the Facebook group about defamation. I stupidly told Erin to be careful putting something in writing because it was defamatory. But Erin, buoyed by her experience of proofreading a church newsletter, I know that's sarcastic, I know it's catty, it's who I am. Just it's who I am. Okay, a church newsletter. She disagreed with me. Now, I know little about hiding mushrooms, poison, accountancy, or goat husbandry like Erin does, but I do know defamation law. But she just wouldn't take any advice at all. And that's when I realised she didn't give SFA what the law said. With her, it's about vengeance. More about that to come later. And perhaps Erin is the most dangerous kind of person, someone who feels the world owes them something and is smart enough to plan how they're going to take it back. So there you go. That's my latest theory on Erin, but my daughter's loaned me one of her criminology textbooks, so I'm going to be diving into that. I have something for you at the end of the week. Now, Duncan McNabb, I was meant to have an episode with him and we recorded it, but the file was so big it crashed my iPad and my iPad died. So look, we're going to have to re-record it at some point because I wanted to use my friend's studio, but her dog is sick at the moment. So just give us some time and we'll sort it out, Duncan and I. Now, thank you so much for your time. You're a dead set legend. I like talking to you. Make sure you sign up for the newsletter, mushroommurdertrial.com. If you feel like rewarding me for the blood, sweat and tears that is this labour of love, I'd appreciate that. You can from $5, but only if you can afford it. And thank you to everyone who's donated. You could go to buy me a coffee, but all the links are in the show notes along with my socials. But you have a great week. And I'm going to be back later. I'm going to be reading this textbook like no one's business. It'll be very exciting. But thank you, and I shall speak to you very, very soon. Bye.